My stepmother had my father sign a new will while he was dying. The nurse saw everything. This story begins with a phone call at 4:17 in the morning. The call was from a hospice nurse named Margaret. She had a quiet, steady voice, the voice of someone who makes these calls regularly and has learned that steadiness is the most important thing she can offer. She told me my father had passed at 4:08 a.m. She said he had been peaceful. She said I could come whenever I was ready. I drove to the hospice in the dark, still in the clothes I had fallen asleep in, and I sat with my father for an hour before anyone else arrived. His room was very still. The machines had been turned off. The window faced east, and the sky was just beginning to lighten. And I thought about all the things I had not said, and all the things I had said, and whether the ratio was right. It was not right. It is never right. My stepmother, Diane, arrived 40 minutes after I did. She was composed in the way she was always composed, dressed, hair arranged, expression calibrated to grief, without being consumed by it. She put her hand on my shoulder. She said she was so sorry. I thanked her. I meant it. In that moment. Whatever had existed between us, and there was quite a lot that had existed between us, felt distant and irrelevant in that room. 3 days later, at the reading of my father's will, I discovered that the will I was hearing was not the one I had seen 14 months earlier. And 3 weeks after that, Margaret called me again. She said, "I've been thinking about whether to call you since the night your father died. I need to tell you what I saw." My name is Isabel. I am 37 years old. My father was a man named Thomas Reyes, and this is the story of what happened in his room on the last night of his life, and what one woman's decision to speak changed about everything that came after. Subscribe and stay with me, because what Margaret saw that night is something she has carried for 3 weeks, and what she chose to do with it is something I will never stop being grateful for. Let me tell you about my father. Thomas Reyes was 68 years old when he died. He had spent 30 years as a civil engineer in Sacramento, California, a quiet, methodical man who designed drainage systems and flood control infrastructure and took genuine satisfaction in work that most people never thought about and everyone benefited from. He had rough hands and a careful mind, and a laugh that was infrequent enough to be worth waiting for. My mother, Eleanor, died when I was 22, a car accident, sudden and without warning. My father grieved her in the way of a man who had been with someone since he was 23 and did not fully know who he was without her. He kept going. He went to work. He called me every Sunday. He maintained the house in the specific way of someone performing the motions of a life while the interior of it reconfigures itself into something new. For 7 years after my mother died, my father lived alone. I visited monthly. We had Sunday dinners when I was in Sacramento and phone calls when I wasn't, and our relationship in those years was quiet and honest, in the way that relationships become when pretense has been stripped away by grief, and what remains is the essential thing. He met Diane at a neighborhood association meeting when he was 58. She was 52, recently divorced, a former real estate agent who had shifted into property management. She was attractive and organized and very good at making people feel that her attention was a gift. She was also, and this is the thing I noticed and did not name clearly enough at the time, very good at making herself indispensable. Within 6 months of meeting my father, Diane had reorganized his kitchen, taken over his bill payments, established a routine for his household that reflected her preferences more than his, and positioned herself as the person who understood what he needed better than anyone else did. She did all of this with warmth and apparent love, and my father, a man who had been alone for 7 years and had forgotten what it felt like to be tended to, received it with gratitude that I understood and could not fully trust. They married 2 years after meeting. I was not opposed to the marriage. I want to say that clearly. I was cautious, and my caution was not welcomed, but I was not opposed. My father had been lonely for a long time, and Diane appeared to make him happy, and I believed, in the way you believe things you want to be true, that the appearance was accurate. My father was diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition 3 years into their marriage. It was not sudden. The symptoms had been present for some time before anyone named them. A tremor. Difficulty with word retrieval. Moments of confusion that were easy to attribute to tiredness or stress until they were no longer easy to attribute to anything except what they actually were. The diagnosis changed things. Not immediately, and not all at once, but in the way that a diagnosis changes the shape of everything that follows. The future reorganizes itself around the condition, and the people in the life reorganize themselves around the future. Diane reorganized herself very efficiently. She became the gatekeeper, the interpreter, the person who spoke for my father in medical appointments, who communicated with his doctors, who managed his medications and his schedule, and his contact with the outside world. She did this, she said, because she loved him, and it was necessary. I believed the necessity. I was less certain about what was driving it. My father's access to me became, over the 2 years following his diagnosis, increasingly mediated by Diane. Calls that went through her, visits that were scheduled around her availability, information about his condition that reached me through her characterization rather than his own account. He was, by the 3rd year after his diagnosis, considerably diminished in ways I could see when I visited, and I visited less often than I should have, which is a thing I will carry for the rest of my life. I had seen the original will 14 months before he died. My father had shown it to me himself during a visit when Diane was out. He had been clear in that conversation, lucid and specific, and himself in a way that he was not always himself by then. He had told me what the will contained. He had told me he wanted me to know. The will he showed me that day was not the will that was read 3 days after his death. Drop a fire in the comments if you already feel the weight of what's coming, because what happened in that hospice room on the last night of my father's life is something no daughter should have to learn after the fact. My father's estate was not enormous by any measure. A house in Sacramento that had been paid off for 12 years. Retirement savings accumulated over 30 years of careful, consistent work. A modest investment account. Some personal property. Furniture, tools, a collection of civil engineering texts he had annotated over decades that no one but him would find valuable, and that I wanted more than anything else in the estate. The will I had seen 14 months before his death divided the estate clearly. The house would go to Diane for the duration of her life, then revert to me. The retirement accounts and investments were split, 60% to Diane, 40% to me. The personal property was addressed item by item, with specific pieces designated for me, for my father's brother, for 2 longtime friends. It was a thoughtful document. It reflected my father's values: care for his wife, care for his daughter, fairness, specificity. The will that was read 3 days after his death was different. The house went to Diane outright, not life estate outright. The retirement accounts and investments went to Diane entirely. My 40% had become 0. The personal property was addressed in a single sentence. Diane would determine the disposition of personal effects at her discretion. The annotated engineering texts were not mentioned. I sat in the attorney's office and I listened to the reading, and I felt something happen in my body that I did not fully process until I was in my car in the parking garage. Not grief. Grief was already there, had been there for weeks, was the background condition of everything. Something more specific. The specific recognition of someone who has just understood that a thing they trusted was not what it appeared to be. I called the attorney after the reading. I asked when the will had been revised. He told me it had been executed 11 days before my father's death. I asked who had arranged the revision. He said Diane had contacted his office. He said my father had been present and had signed. He said the document was valid. I asked if my father had been evaluated for capacity at the time of signing. A pause. The attorney said that was a question for the circumstances of the signing, which he had not been present for. I hired an estate attorney the following week. Her name was Christine Park. She had been practicing probate and estate litigation in California for 16 years. She reviewed the documents, and she asked me, carefully and precisely, everything I knew about my father's condition in the weeks before his death. I told her what I knew. I told her about the diagnosis, the progression, the mediation of Diane, the lucid conversation 14 months earlier, and the difference between that conversation and the conversations I had managed to have with my father in the weeks before he died. Christine listened to all of it. Then she said, "Is there anyone who was present with your father in the period around the signing? Anyone who might have observed his condition directly?" I thought about it. The hospice staff, the nurses who had been with him in his final weeks. I thought about Margaret. Stay with me, because Margaret had been thinking about me too. Margaret Chen had been a hospice nurse for 19 years. She was 51, methodical, and possessed of the specific kind of moral clarity that comes from spending 2 decades in proximity to death, from understanding, with a precision most people never develop, what matters and what does not. She had been my father's primary nurse for the last 3 weeks of his life. She had been present for his good hours and his difficult ones. She had administered his medications and monitored his condition, and sat with him in the specific way of someone who understands that presence is itself a form of care. She had also been present on the night 11 days before his death, when a woman arrived at the hospice at 8:47 in the evening, with a man she introduced as an attorney, and a document she said needed to be signed. Margaret told me this on the phone, 3 weeks after my father died, in the careful and precise language of someone who has been composing the account in her mind for 21 days and is now delivering it exactly as she prepared it. She said, Diane had arrived with the attorney unannounced. She had told the night staff that she had important paperwork that Thomas needed to sign. Estate documents, she said. Time sensitive. The night staff had allowed her in because she was his wife. They had not flagged it or questioned it because spouses brought paperwork, and it was not unusual. Margaret had been in the room when Diane and the attorney entered. She had been adjusting my father's medication line. She had stayed. My father had been awake. That was accurate. But awake, Margaret said, was a word that required significant qualification in the context of where my father was in his illness at that point. He had been having a poor day, one of the worst in the preceding week. He had been confused about where he was on 2 occasions that afternoon. He had called out for my mother, who had been dead for 15 years. He had, in the hour before Diane arrived, asked Margaret what day it was 3 times in 20 minutes. He was not capable of understanding what he was signing, Margaret told me. Her voice was steady. He was not capable of meaningful consent. I know what that looks like. I have seen it many times. What I saw that night was not a man making a decision. She described what followed. Diane had sat beside him. She had held his hand. She had spoken to him in the soft, patient tone of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say. She had told him she needed him to sign some papers. Important papers, she said, for the house, for the future, so that everything would be taken care of. She had said it several times, in slightly different ways, until he had said yes. The attorney had placed the document in front of him and guided his hand. My father had signed. The attorney had witnessed it and notarized it, and they had left within 20 minutes. Margaret had stood in that room after they left. She had looked at my father, who had already drifted back into a confused, half-sleep. She had thought about what she had just witnessed. She had thought about it for the 3 weeks between that night and the morning she called me. I should have stopped it, she said. I didn't know how. I didn't know what the document was. I wasn't certain enough in the moment to intervene. I have thought about that every day since. She had called me, she said, because she had decided that not saying anything was worse than saying something. That whatever came of it, the truth was the truth, and I deserved to have it. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after she finished. Then I called Christine. Type Margaret in the comments if you think she did the right thing, because calling me took everything she had. Christine Park had seen cases like this before. Not identical. No 2 are identical. But the shape of it was familiar. A vulnerable person in the final stages of illness. A document executed in circumstances that raised significant questions about capacity. A witness who had been present and had concerns she had not known how to act on at the time. This is not a simple case, Christine told me at our second meeting. But it is not a hopeless one. What Margaret witnessed is exactly the kind of testimony that probate courts take seriously in capacity challenges. The question is whether we can build a sufficient record around it. Building the record took 4 months. Margaret agreed to provide a formal affidavit. She did this knowing what it would cost her. Potential conflict with the hospice administration. Potential scrutiny of her professional judgment. The particular vulnerability of someone who acknowledges they witnessed something wrong and did not immediately act. She provided the affidavit anyway, 4 pages, specific and detailed and devastating in its clarity. Christine subpoenaed my father's medical records from the hospice. The records documented his condition in the weeks before his death with clinical precision. The confusion episodes, the cognitive assessments, the specific notes from Margaret and other staff about his level of orientation on specific dates. The entry for the evening of the signing, made by Margaret in real time, before she knew what the document was, noted that the patient had been disoriented on 3 occasions during the shift and had required repeated reorientation. Christine retained a neurologist who specialized in capacity assessment to review the records. His opinion, delivered in a 12-page report, was that the documented level of cognitive impairment on the evening of the signing was inconsistent with the capacity required for valid execution of a testamentary document. We obtained the attorney's records through discovery. The attorney, a man named Gerald Marsh, who had a small general practice and had been retained by Diane specifically for this document, had no contemporaneous notes documenting any capacity assessment. He had not asked the hospice staff about my father's condition. He had not requested medical records. He had arrived, presented the document, witnessed the signature, and left. Gerald Marsh, it emerged during discovery, had done one previous piece of work for Diane. A property transfer 2 years earlier that had reorganized the ownership of a rental property she had brought into the marriage in a way that my father had apparently agreed to, but that none of his prior advisors had been involved in. Christine raised an eyebrow where she told me this. "It's a pattern," she said. "Not conclusive, but a pattern." Diane retained her own attorney, a more substantial firm than Gerald Marsh, the kind of firm that is retained when someone understands that the situation is serious. There were months of filings and counter-filings and depositions, and the specific grinding machinery of contested probate litigation. Diane maintained throughout that my father had been lucid, that he had understood what he was signing, that the will reflected his genuine wishes. She was deposed in March. Christine conducted the deposition. I was not present. Christine had advised against it, correctly. What I know of what happened comes from Christine's account afterward. Diane was composed. She was articulate. She had an answer for everything. Until Christine asked her about the rental property transfer, about Gerald Marsh, about the specific timeline of her relationship with an attorney who had no documented history of estate work before being retained for a document executed in a hospice room at 8:47 in the evening. She didn't fall apart, Christine told me, but something changed. She understood, I think, that we had more than she had expected us to have. Don't go anywhere, because what happened in the months after that deposition is the part of this story that gave my father back some of what was taken from him. The case settled in June, 8 months after my father's death. I want to be precise about what settling meant, because it is not the same as winning, and it is not the same as losing, and it is important to say what it actually was. The settlement restored the distribution of the original will, the one my father had shown me 14 months before his death, the one that reflected his actual wishes as he had expressed them to me when he was still himself. Diane retained her life estate in the house. The retirement and investment accounts were divided as my father had originally intended. The personal property was addressed with the specificity he had wanted. The annotated engineering texts came to me. Diane did not admit wrongdoing. That is standard in settlements, and I had been prepared for it. What she did, by agreeing to the terms, was acknowledge that the will executed in the hospice room was not going to hold. That the record we had built was sufficient to make litigation more costly and more risky than settlement. Gerald Marsh was referred to the California State Bar for investigation. I do not know the outcome of that investigation. Christine told me the referral was appropriate and necessary, and that what happened with it was not something I could control. Margaret was not disciplined. The hospice administration reviewed the situation and determined that she had not violated any professional obligation on the night of the signing. She had not had sufficient information to know what the document was, and her decision to come forward after the fact was, in the administration's assessment, exactly what a nurse of her integrity should do. She continues to work at the hospice. I sent her a letter after the settlement. I told her what her call had made possible. I told her I knew what it had cost her to make it. She wrote back. Her letter was 3 paragraphs. She said she was glad she had called. She said she had thought about my father many times since that night, about the man he had clearly been, visible even in diminishment, in the books by his bed, and the photographs on the windowsill, and the way he had reached for my hand when I visited, even when he was no longer certain who I was. I cried for a long time after I read that letter. Not the sharp grief of the early weeks, something slower and more complex. The grief of understanding fully what had been taken from him in that room, and the gratitude for the woman who had decided that the truth was worth the cost of telling it. Diane and I have not spoken since the settlement was signed. I do not expect we will. Whatever grief I once felt for what might have been between us, the stepmother relationship that never fully formed, the potential for something genuine that was always undermined by what I now understand was happening underneath. That grief has been replaced by something cleaner, a clear account of what occurred, an accurate record. I can work with an accurate record. I have found that I cannot work with anything else. Type justice in the comments, because that is the only word for what finally happened. I have thought many times about what to take from all of this. Not the legal outcome, that is its own account concluded, but the human story underneath it, which is the one I will be living with for the rest of my life. My father spent his last years in a situation he could not fully see, and could not fully report, and could not fully protect himself from. This is the specific vulnerability of cognitive decline. It removes, incrementally, and then all at once, the capacity to identify when you are being managed and to articulate what is happening to the people who might help you. He had been, I believe, a man who knew something was wrong and lacked the resources to say so in a way that would be heard. I did not visit enough in his last 2 years. That is true. I have had to make peace with it, in the way you make peace with things you cannot undo. Not by forgiving yourself exactly, but by understanding the conditions that produced the failure and deciding to learn from them. The condition that produced my failure, in part, was Diane. The mediated calls, the scheduled visits, the information that reached me through her characterization. I had known something was wrong, and I had told myself it was manageable. It was not manageable. I was wrong. What I want to say to anyone who is watching this and recognizing something, anyone who has a parent in a relationship with someone whose control over that parent concerns them, is this: trust what you notice. Not as an accusation, not as a declaration, but as information worth taking seriously. Visit in person. Arrange to see your parent alone. Document what you observe. Talk to the people around them: the aides, the nurses, the neighbors, the friends. The people who see your parent in the ordinary texture of their days often know things that the people managing the situation do not want known. Margaret knew. She had been in that room for 3 weeks, watching my father be himself and watching him fail to be himself, and she had seen clearly what happened on the night of the signing. She had known what she saw, and she had needed 3 weeks to find the courage to say it. I am grateful she found that courage. I am also, honestly, a little heartbroken that it took courage at all. That speaking the truth about what she witnessed, simply reporting what she had seen with her own eyes, required her to weigh costs and prepare herself and decide that the right thing was worth the risk of doing it. It should not require courage to tell the truth, but it does sometimes. And the people who do it anyway, who carry something difficult for 3 weeks and then pick up the phone, are the people who make justice possible for everyone else. Margaret made justice possible. She did not do it for any reward. She did not do it because she was certain of the outcome. She did it because she had seen something and could not live with having stayed silent about it. That is the entire story. And it is the part of the story I think about most. It is October now, 14 months since my father died. The house in Sacramento is still occupied by Diane under the terms of the life estate. I have not been back to it. I am not certain I will go back while she is there, and she may be there for a long time. That is what the original will provided for, and it is appropriate. My father wanted her to have the house for her life. That was his decision, made when he was himself. I have the annotated engineering texts. They are in my apartment in Portland, on a shelf I specifically cleared for them. They are not valuable in any commercial sense. They are valuable in every sense that matters. The margins are full of my father's handwriting, questions, corrections, observations accumulated over decades of a career he was proud of. They are the most complete record I have of how his mind worked. I read them sometimes, not the technical content. I am not an engineer, and most of it is beyond me. But the marginalia, the small notations of a careful man thinking carefully about his work. I find him in those pages in a way I cannot find him anywhere else. Margaret and I exchanged one more letter after the initial one. She mentioned a book she had been reading, something about the ethics of care in end-of-life medicine. I sent her a copy of a different book I thought she might like. We have not spoken since, but the exchange felt like the right kind of ending. Two people who were connected by a specific and difficult circumstance, who had done what they needed to do, who parted with something like mutual respect. My father's brother came to visit me in August. We spent a weekend talking about Thomas, not the illness, not the legal situation, just him. The man he had been before any of this. The stories that belong only to people who knew him early, before he was anyone's father or anyone's husband. I learned things I had not known, that he had once wanted to be an architect and had shifted to engineering because he thought it was more useful. That he had been, as a young man, genuinely funny in a way the illness had taken from him long before the end. That he had kept a photograph of my mother in his wallet until the day he died, tucked behind his driver's license where Diane would not see it. His brother told me this last thing, and then was quiet for a moment. He never stopped loving her, he said. I think you knew that. I did know that. I had always known it. It is one of the things that is simply true, and that no document executed in a hospice room at 8:47 in the evening could change. If this story found you somewhere you needed it, if you recognize something in the careful attention that comes too late, or in the woman who picked up the phone after 3 weeks of thinking, or in the specific grief of a document that does not reflect the person you knew, leave a comment. Tell me where you are. Subscribe for new stories every week. See you next time. All stories on this channel are fictional narratives created for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real persons, companies, or events is coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of elder vulnerability, family accountability, and the courage to speak the truth.